this month. Barrett Ristroph is an attorney doing a lot of work with Alaska Native communities. And I think all of us have heard about Newtok, Alaska, and other Native communities that potentially are at risk of falling into the ocean, and of the retreat and the other sort of measures that are happening in Alaska. It's one of those things that's been going on for years. And Barrett's going to give us an update on Newtok and anything else in that general sphere that she thinks is relevant. But we're very glad to have her here. It's always good to kind of be thinking about, even it is now, we're starting to get more glamorous cities, such as Miami or whatever, kind of remembering a lot of communities that would generally get kind of forgotten if it wasn't for the novelty of the news cycle. So Barrett, thank you so much, and we will turn it over to you.
All right, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and let's see if this works. Let's see. All right, are you all able to see the slideshow now?
Yeah, it looks great.
Excellent. So what do you do when you can see the water coming closer and closer to your community? I'm going to share some updates on the relocation of the Alaska Native village of Newtok, which is an indigenous community and a federally recognized tribe. I started working with them when I was completing my PhD on how Alaska Native villages are adapting to climate change and other challenges, and what are the political and legal factors that impede adaptation and relocation. Along with them, I've been working with several other nonprofit groups and tribal governments, mostly on climate change and natural resource issues. So a little bit about Newtok. It's situated on an inlet of the sea, called a river, but really an inlet of the sea, in southwestern Alaska. Climate change has melted the permafrost that stabilized the bank and increased the severity of the storms, so the village is literally crumbling into the sea. The state of Alaska Hazard Mitigation Plan uses the Yupik Eskimo word for the phenomenon of melting permafrost and erosion. That word is ustek, and that's what you can see in this photograph of this house that is actually no longer there anymore. If you're curious, you can go on Google Map and see the boundaries of the village on the left and compare them to the aerial photo taken more recently. The erosion that's causing that land loss is episodic. It's driven by storms rather than being gradual, but it's going fast. In 2007, the Army Corps estimated that the whole community would be underwater by the end of the 2020s, and it seems to be on track to do this. These houses, one of the ones was the one you saw in the last picture, it's no longer there. It was bought out and demolished through FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, through FEMA's hazard mitigation program, and the people were able to move out just in time before a storm came that destroyed the underlying land. There's a lot of existing challenges in Newtok that are exacerbated by ustek and flooding. There's never been any running water in any of the homes here, nor are there any roads into or within the community, although cell phones do work here. The washateria, where people could take showers and wash their clothes, has been broken for months. The generator has been spotty for more than a year now as it awaits repairs. The landfill has already eroded away, and people are diligently collecting their trash in bags, but there's no good place to put it. Likewise, the sewage lagoon is no longer intact. So if you can imagine, people are already having to use the bathroom in a bucket in their house. Then they're carrying this bucket to the river to dispose of it. And you can imagine that this would give off a smell, especially when the weather is warm. But this is a place that has a rich culture, and people are intent on keeping this culture. And when I was walking down the boardwalks last summer, I could hear kids speaking their own indigenous language. This is why they don't want to just get up and move to a big city like Anchorage, even if that might be easier in some ways. Here, they're able to continue to do their traditional hunting and fishing, and they're better able to exercise their tribal sovereignty. While the control of Alaska tribes over their land is not recognized, they do have recognized sovereignty over their members, and this allows them to have tribal courts and exclude alcohol from the community. The community has been planning to move for decades. They selected a site 9 miles away called Muktivik or Mertivik. The site is an island, technically, but it's the only high ground for miles. The local village corporation that owns the land under Newtok at the existing site got an act of Congress to do a trade for land in the National Wildlife Refuge that's located at the new site, Muktivik. This right here, you can see the cover of a report with a very general idea for moving. This was done back in 2011 by some consultants hired by the state. There was enough outside government funding to pay for planning, but as in many cases, there's just not enough for an actual move and little insight on how to ever get this funding. So you had the vague plan, and then there were problems with money management and embezzlement by former leadership. The tribe elected a new council. They ended up having to get a lawyer, Michael Wallery, to get the Bureau of Indian Affairs to recognize the leadership change and stop giving funding to the previous government. So Mike turned out to be a visionary in the relocation process. With the help of Alaska's congressional delegation, the Denali Commission, which is a peculiar federal agency, but only for Alaska. It works uniquely in Alaska on rural development. So through Congress and with the Denali Commission, Newtok got $15 million in funding to start making the actual move happen. That was only a couple of years ago. The Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, which is a nonprofit tribal entity that specializes in water and sewer development, was placed in charge of managing all that money. Denali Commission also funded what they call a relocation coordinator, who is Romy Caliente, and he has been critical to carrying out all the little details that have to do with relocating. The Denali Commission money, however, has just about run out after the 2019 construction season. That construction really focused on infrastructure, and it got about 80% of the infrastructure the village needs in terms of utilities, but just a handful of houses, and the houses are actually the village's highest priority. The village has been navigating difficult questions about who gets to move first, what are the obligations of those who do get to live in the new houses, and where will funding come from to get more houses and sustain the village. I mentioned the Denali Commission as the main source of money so far, but there are other sources. Since Denali Commission money is flexible, the village has been leveraging it as a source for matching funds to get projects that do require matching funds. So in general, agencies seem much less willing to provide money for housing than they do for infrastructure. So housing money is the big challenge. It's particularly challenging given the housing crisis in rural Alaska. It often takes at least $500,000 to build a house in a remote place where there's no roads going into it. And you can spend all that money and still not even have a toilet in your house. So you have villages in southwestern Alaska with 15 people living in them, and each subfamily is occupying one bedroom. There's little in the way of income in most villages, and people are depending on regional housing authorities funded by Housing and Urban Development to construct houses. But especially for villages in need of relocation, there's just no way that the housing authority can keep up with the demand. Fortunately for Newtok, a number of residents have gained skills and jobs in construction from the relocation, so they do have some source of income. So we developed a housing policy that requires the residents who did get those first 15 homes in Muktivik to make payments for them based on a percentage of their income. We are counting on this money to serve as a match for grants to get houses to move the rest of the Newtok residents over. This housing policy, you're just seeing a shot of the first page, was super difficult to draft, and it may be difficult to implement. It's already been amended a few times and likely will be continued to be amended as new situations come up that we didn't foresee before. I mentioned FEMA earlier as a funder. We've been lucky to have good grant writers and grant administrators who can navigate the complicated means of getting assistance from FEMA before and after disasters. By the way, FEMA does not consider USTEC or erosion a disaster under the Stafford Act, which defines disaster. Drought is the only slow-moving disaster that's considered a disaster under the Stafford Act. But we've had a helpful engineer who's willing to work on a lump sum basis. His name is Patrick LeMay. Most recently, he's gotten Newtok funding to build the gravel pads on which houses will stand, because this is a very marshy area. And he's also gotten funding to finish out the water system at the new place, Muktivik. He's also trying to get a grant to buy out the remaining houses in Newtok. There's about 39 left. That buyout money is only a fraction of the cost for a new house at Muktivik, but it can be a match for a grant or a down payment for a mortgage. I have another ISAT presentation I did last year where I talk about the sustainability challenges of remote Alaska villages that have been heavily subsidized until Alaska's recent oil crunch. The lack of funding combined with increasing climate hazards is going to continue to be a challenge for many Alaska villages. At least Muktivik now has a chance to succeed. I'd be interested in talking in more detail with people who worked in similar situations about how they navigated the financial and political challenges of community relocation. And at this point, I'm going to stop, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Hi, if it's okay if I kick us off, I'm Katie. I work at Georgetown Climate Center here in DC. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the housing policy that you had on one of the slides. Is that available online as a resource, and also sort of what led to the development of it? And you had mentioned sort of the continuing ongoing amendments to it as you sort of go along in this process.
Sure, and it's not like a public document under Freedom of Information Act, I guess, because it's not a state agency, but I think the tribe would be happy to share it. I will double check first, because I think that would be a model for other people looking at this situation. The difficulty is in the fairness factor of it. I think that's what's made it the most excruciating thing. We kept on thinking, what are all the possibilities that might happen? Like, for example, you don't want to give someone a house and then they turn around and try to sell it to someone else and they leave. If you're giving someone a house, you want them to stay. You also want them to pay a fair amount of income. And the reason why we had to think so hard about this is because the Denali Commission made it clear. You're getting your $15 million, that's seed money, you're not going to get any more. So it was very clear that no agency was going to give all the money needed for everyone to get a house. So this is, in a sense, it's rationing. It's planning for the next 20, 30 years to think about, okay, how can we leverage this to get each and every person who wants to be over here to get them into a house. And then on top of that, I mentioned the overcrowding. I mentioned the houses that have 15 people in them. I guess you want to move every household over first, but at some point, some of those households are going to want their own home. So how do you navigate that in a just way? How do you deal with the people who maybe already left because of the crowding or job opportunities, but now they want to come back to Muktivik? Do they stand in line until everyone at Newtok has moved? So just to work on this, it involved me sitting down with the council for these 3-hour at a time sessions with a skeleton outline that I had written and just asking these excruciating questions like, So what if someone wants to do this? Do you let them, or do you put this? And so it was just hours and hours of sitting there and talking through with the council. But I will get back to you on sharing it, and I would love to share if that's okay with them.
That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi, it's Louis Conway here. You mentioned that their culture is still, a vital culture. They've kept their language. What do you attribute to that cultural vitality? What are some of the factors in the community that have kept the culture strong?
I think one is that this place is just so remote. A lot of rural places in Alaska have no road connections leading to them. And so part of it is just being that far off the beaten track. The other thing, though, is you don't have some kind of good there that everyone else wants. For example, I lived up in the North Slope of Alaska for a number of years. While the Inupiaq language is still spoken to some degree over there, it's mainly by elders. So many outsiders came up because of the oil rush. So different people are in different levels of being more or less westernized, but maybe what makes Newtok particularly different from some of the other Yupik speaking villages is, I've seen particularly just peculiar to this village, they put so much of an emphasis on their language. They're making sure that it's being spoken in the school, so the kids are learning that, and it's something that the elders in that community really wanted. I also feel like a lot of the tradition in all these places is tied to the ability to keep on doing the traditional hunting and fishing. In some places in Alaska, you have so much competition from outsiders. There's so many regulations and laws that complicate hunting and fishing. It makes it harder to do that. But when you have less restriction and you're able to go out and do that traditional life way, then I think it may be complementary to being able to help keep the culture and the language intact.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is Patrick. I have a question. Actually, it's a two-part question. Number one, do you have this is a good overview of Newtok. Do you have a sense about, in general, about how other Native communities in Alaska are being affected / responding? I know Alaska is a huge, diverse place, but I'm just kind of wondering a general sense. And the other question would be, you just spoke about sort of the isolation of Newtok in a lot of ways. Is there any consideration given to maybe working with other, other Alaska Native communities, or like, is there any like networks developing, or maybe, outreach or such to other communities or other organizations, beyond just sort of the federal stuff we're talking about?
Yes, there's an annual conference that most of the tribes and Native corporations come to called the Alaska Federation of Natives, and Newtok has presented there a number of times. Most recently, we did in October, we had a small community-to-community meeting to talk with other people. I think there's a desire of Newtok to help other people. I think certainly this organization I mentioned, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, also wants to learn lessons from this relocation, because there's 31 or so other villages that are going to be in similar situation needing that help. I think what's challenging is that there are 229 tribal communities in Alaska. Some of them no longer have a village site, but each one is a nation. Each one has so much on its plate, and climate change, as severe as that may be, is just one challenge that they're juggling. And it's hard to keep your eye on so many balls at one time unless your house is literally about to fall into the water. So while it's an issue for other communities, they want to know when there are so many things going on just to keep everything afloat. Maybe they don't have as much capacity to join up and work on this as they might like to if they had all the time and money in the world. But certainly there is thought about it. Certainly Newtok does want to share with other folks, and certainly there are people having these conversations. One other thing, Patrick, I can send you an article that I did on this, because Newtok is not the first village to relocate. You know, until I'd say about the 60s, all kinds of villages just picked up and relocated anytime there was a flood. The land regimes were less solidified. The Western infrastructure was less expensive and ossifying. So it was a lot easier to move before. And in modern times, it doesn't get much publicity, but there are villages who just said, okay, I'm going to use my community block development grant money, and I'm going to start building a new subdivision higher on the hill. And it's not very dramatic. It doesn't make the news, but it is maybe a slow relocation that tribes who are in a position to do so because they're located near high ground are able to do. What made New Talk so dramatic was just the total lack of any high ground nearby, hence the need to completely go out to some place where there might be higher grounds.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And it is interesting you mentioned that, like, because historically, through the vast majority of human history, people just kind of got up and moved, you know, one way or other. And so now we're, you know, in a kind of a different space where, you know, we're so bare, it's so like dug deep in infrastructure. I think I'm echoing, so I'll shut up. But yeah, thank you. Anybody else?
Hi, yeah, this is Shamika. I'm wondering if you could mention or if you could think of any of the particular communities that did use those community block development grants to potentially move to higher grounds.
Yes, I am thinking of one, Nulato, N-U-L-T-O. Nulato in the 1980s, they're in the interior. I guess people don't think of the interior communities so much as dealing with flooding and erosion, but they do have extreme erosion from the rivers, which naturally change course. And then with the permafrost melting on the riverbeds, it can be a similar thing. But Nulato was able to just about completely get up the hill. Although ironically, the federal government decided to redo the school in the lower grounds. They still have the school down at the bottom. But that was the first one that comes to mind, and I imagine there's others.
Okay.
Hi, this is Katie. I have one more question if I'm not cutting anybody else off. You had mentioned that in your experience with this relocation, or maybe others as well, it's much more difficult to find funding for purposes of housing compared to infrastructure. Do you have any insights on why you think that's happening, or is it just, you know, the availability of what grants you can get from the federal and state government?
Yeah, maybe this sounds kind of jaded, but if you give a house to someone, you know, chances are that the value is going to go down. They're going to use it. There's going to be problems with it. It's just one family. So I think in the mind of the funders, it doesn't seem to be as much bang for buck. Whereas if you invest in community infrastructure, it looks good. Like, of course, everyone needs to have this water system, and they do need the water system. But people are cagey about wanting to take a chance and spending money on private families, individuals who may or may not keep up the infrastructure of their homes, whereas maybe there's more certainty that the community is going to keep up the water system or whatever because everyone's depending on it.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Vanessa. I'm actually from Seward, Alaska originally. My question is tied to Kivalina, actually, because I know that they were not able to move at one point when they were wanting to move. Oh, this is probably about 20 years ago almost, because of insurance. And I'm wondering if you've had any issues with insurance either for the homes or for the new city itself, or if that hasn't really been talked about yet, or if it's not recognized.
I would be very curious to hear more about the insurance issues with Kivalina. I know Kivalina's had a number of challenges, in part that there's been a difference of opinion in the community about whether to and where to move. And there's been a lot of heartburn about whether to move to the particular location. And you may know the latest as well as I do in terms of finally the state funding that road that will go toward a new school on land, and there's hope that the community will coalesce around that new school at the new site. I never heard of there being any issue with insurance, but yeah, maybe we could talk offline about that. As far as insurance, generally it's a requirement of most funding that the property that's being bought by the funding is insured. So indeed, that was something that needed to be considered in the housing policy for Reykjavik. And when we realized it's going to be probably hard to get people to make monthly insurance payments, they're probably going to be pretty high. So I worked with the insurance agent for Newtalk's other property and said, hey, Newtalk is going to just add all of these homes, even though they're privately owned, but Newtalk is going to add it to Newtalk's policy insurance to get a collective cheaper rate. And then Newtalk will seek reimbursement from the homeowners, and they'll end up paying cheaper. But that way, we don't have to worry about what if the homeowner forgets or doesn't want to pay the insurance and then the building burns down. Basically, the buck is going to stop with the Newtalk Council.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's great.
Pricey. It is, well, it's probably not pricey. I think there's a reasonable rate considering how far away and how remote it is. But I think these houses cost more than $500,000 to replace. And so you want to have some kind of insurance on it, because if it burns down, it's all over.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, this is Colleen from First Street Management. I think I have kind of like a more abstract question, which is from learning from this community, what do you think is like a big opportunity or opportunities that we're missing or overlooking that maybe we can work on maybe in our own practice or just in general think of in terms of what it means to relocate communities? Like what are some big or maybe small kind of opportunities that we should focus on?
Sure. I finished my PhD in planning, but I confess that I'm a little bit jaded about planning because I saw so much money being spent on strategic plans for Shishmarov, Kivalina, Newtalk, that resulted in absolutely nothing, did not contribute to moving in any way. It's just there happened to be funding available for a big plan and nothing else. So the biggest things that I see that are important to do, you need to do some kind of measuring erosion and accretion to see if there actually is a need to move and where you might move. There needs to be some kind of basic soil and groundwork. And the other thing that I see is that you want to have some idea, you want to know where you're going to relocate to, what's the higher ground, is it suitable for settling there? And then you're kind of faced with realizing we may not be able to move the whole village at a time. So what are these little funding opportunities that we can get? If you're a tribe, then there's little amounts of Bureau of Indian Affairs money available to you. Even if you're not a tribe, communities have access to different funding streams under FEMA. Whenever there's a disaster that's declared in that state, there's a certain chunk, a percentage of that money from the disaster that then goes into what's called a hazard mitigation grant. And the communities and the state can apply for funding for that. And that can purchase home buyouts and home relocations. There's a smaller pot of funding annually called the pre-disaster mitigation grant that can go to do a few home buyouts or to put down some infrastructure for new houses. So unfortunately, so much of this money relies on there to be a disaster or thinking about disaster. And we're having to go through this idea of emergency, which in many ways it is an emergency, because while it's possible to get community block development grants, the wording of them is not too great in terms of being prepared for relocation or using that money to think about relocation. And it would make more sense to rely on housing and urban development as the agency that would maybe step up and do more of this relocation work. But in fact, we're kind of seem to be stuck with FEMA, this emergency agency, as the agency that's taking the lead in relocation and adaptation.
That's great, thank you. Lots to think about.
Yeah, hi, it's Louis Conway here again. So it seems like there isn't any strategy at the state level for making these various moves, and it's all done village by village. Um, is that correct? It's all done village by village, or is there some sort of higher level adaptation strategy at
Pretty
work?
much. There's not. I'm going to be cynical and say that our last governor said, well, we need to drill for more oil so we can get more oil revenue and tax so we can pay to relocate the villages. And he didn't say that are disappearing because of climate change due to fossil fuel emissions. He didn't complete the sentence. But that was kind of the plan for a while. There had been in the past, twice now, there's been two entities, two state level planning efforts to deal with Alaska climate change at a state level. And twice, when the subsequent governor came into office, those got scrapped. Both times there were kind of vague plans, not really saying, okay, we're putting money here and we're going to move this village here. And so I'm always kind of lukewarm on these vague plans that say, oh, we should do something about relocating. I'm much more interested in see something like we're going to go study and see if the soil is stable here so we can set up a house on it, and we're going to allocate this much to moving these houses here and that sort of thing. But no, to summarize the answer to the question, no, at this point in time, Alaska is really not planning collectively to relocate these villages.
Yeah, because if there was a more collective planning, perhaps they could bring down the cost of the per unit cost of the housing units themselves, with more economies of scale. And I'm just looking at the housing forum itself. They all look like little prefab kind of modular units. Is there any particular thing? Has there been any particular process around the forum itself? Maybe something that reflects some kind of traditional lifestyle, or is that just something they've had to?
Oh,
had to
yes, we've
accept?
gone round. Yeah, we've gone round and round and round on this one. There was a plan. There's such thing as Army surplus, and Army surplus had some barracks that were going to be converted into housing and shipped out there. The cost of shipping them out was going to be exorbitant, and people weren't really happy with them. They didn't really want that particular kind. They were taking it. So that idea got scrapped when we realized how expensive it was, and we're going to spend all that money. Why not just build something out there? So we engaged with the Cold Climate Housing Research Center to do the design. It's an agency that's kind of academic and has spent a lot of time thinking about how you design Arctic infrastructure. So they have quite a design. It's great in terms of conserving energy, but the cost just kept getting higher and higher and higher. It is a truss constructed thing, which means it is constructed out there on site. It's not prefab, it is built on site, but it's a simple design. That was the design that was the most energy efficient and oriented in the way that people wanted it. And by the time they were finished with those houses, it was close to $600,000 each without a toilet. So there is another regional agency that does the job for less, closer to $400,000, but those houses aren't as energy efficient, maybe have a few more problems. The housing dilemma in Alaska, you would think that we would have a handle on it by now after decades of kind of westernized housing trying to fit into Alaska, but they still do not. I guess the bottom line is nobody wants to live in sod houses like they used to. People understandably, legitimately want the benefits of Western infrastructure, dry, warm houses, and it's just very hard or expensive to have that in a place. So even if there were collective action, it's not going to help that much because these villages are scattered so far apart and there's not a road going to them. Like, for example, if you had a bunch of villages in the same spot and a road going to them, then their collective action would make sense. Or if you were maybe hiring the same designer and you were doing prefab all in Anchorage and shipping it out, that might be an opportunity for collective action. But that is the great challenge of Alaska and why things in Alaska that should work elsewhere don't work in Alaska, just because of the vastness and the remoteness.
Okay, thank you.
Well, unless there's any more questions, this has been an excellent Q&A session. Thank you, Barrett, for fielding all everyone's questions and giving us a lot of insight on what is going on in Newtok right now. We have about 14 minutes actually, and so I already sort of started out with a bit of announcements, but I was wondering, since we have a little extra time, if there's anybody else that would like to bring up anything of interest to the group that they might have seen in the past month or so. This is kind of an opportunity now that we have some extra time. So if there's any either news stories or opportunities specifically for greater participation by members, please feel free to speak up.
Hey, Patrick, this is Anna from National League of Cities. I have a question for the folks on the line, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Ristroph. That was an amazing presentation. I hope we can maybe see these slides as well. I don't know if you are able to share those later.
Certainly, I can send it to Patrick.
Awesome. Yeah, it was fantastic. One question for you first, Dr. Ristroph. Have you connected with the Government Accountability Office here in DC, Lisa Arsdale and Joe Thompson?
The Government Accountability Office had been out to Alaska and done 2 reports on the inadequacy of help with village adaptation, one in 2003 and one in 2009. They came back again in 2019, looking both at Newtok and then Louisiana right now. They're looking at the Erosion relocation in Louisiana, which in a lot of ways has some similarities to Newtok. So that Government Accountability Office report, it was just circulated back to Newtok to review and check the facts, and it should be out to the public, I'm guessing, in another few months.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I've been in touch with them, and they're doing some really stealth work on this topic over there. And then I have a really off-topic general question for folks on the line. So I know that recently there, I'm not sure where these folks are from. I think University of Waterloo. They came out with some AI projections for population that kind of, I think they used Matt Howers as kind of an inspiration to create something slightly different. And all of these population projections, whether they're AI-based or data modeling, they're all just around sea level rise. And I was curious to know from folks if you have heard of anyone else working on climate projections around like heat thresholds or wildfire impacts, flooding even. Just curious to hear from folks if anyone knows anyone else doing similar work. The only other person I know of is Vivek Shandas in Portland, but that's it. Thanks.
So, Anna, this is Patrick. I specifically, I don't know the answer to that, but the thing that pops into my head is, I was actually trying to Google it right now. The McHarg Center, I think, named after Ian McHarg, the guy who did Design with Nature, that sort of classic book that everyone gets asked about on the AICP exam. They've put out this so-called like atlas, I think, of what was it? The 2100 Project, an atlas for the Green New Deal. And there's a lot of maps and other related data, and I think they try to address some of this. I'm actually on the website right now, and I don't really have time to. I don't want to bore everyone by talking to myself as I find the actual maps, but I think I would recommend kind of looking into that. There's a list of contributors as well that might be able to, either they may not have the answer to the question, but they may be able to point you into who else might be working on it.
Yeah,
so that's what I've got. Is anybody else?
I've seen those, Patrick. Yeah, that's a good thought. I didn't really think that they would be doing modeling around that, but that's actually, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, and actually, I'm just looking at it right now, but there's a couple of them I saw was counting in-migration, out-migration patterns, and one of them specifically mentions Matt Hauer's work, drawing on his work. So looks like all roads lead back to Matt, but yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, unless anybody else has anything else to say, the only one thing I want to mention, I think in The Guardian a couple days ago, there was a story reporting on, I guess, a study from VIMS, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science out in Gloucester, Virginia, about projections that sea level rise is actually accelerating faster than was originally anticipated, and looking like it might come in on high end of some projections. And so that's, of course, going to have direct impacts on a lot of, coastal cities, especially on the East Coast, that are also dealing with subsidence on land. But again, it's sort of an interesting data point to add to things. I also want to make people aware of a tweet that I saw earlier today by Zach Taylor. He's a real estate guy. I think I posted on LinkedIn, but he alluded to something that I've been sort of thinking about a lot, which is the state of Florida. Apparently, I think the county that covers the Florida Keys is thinking right now about trying to encourage development, which might sound like a strange thing for everybody on this call, but among other things, by increasing the sort of the time, evacuation times from 24 hours to 30 hours. Craig Fugate, former FEMA administrator, responded that was, I think he used some pretty strong language about what he thought of that. But it's an interesting thing, and Zach mentioned that he had heard a lot of his personal discussions of the idea of sort of adaptation through growth. And in his opinion, as long as we are sort of in the paradigm that we're in, as in the way infrastructure is funded in the U.S. and such, that it looks like that probably is unfortunately accurate. So it does encourage people to think about, are there other ways of conceptualizing how we fund things, how we organize things to make some things more possible? Because if we're going to really depend on property taxes in an era of declining property values eventually, that's going to make a lot of things really tough. So it does encourage us to think differently. So yeah, so that's all I've got. I think we're we just have a few more minutes, but I very much want to say thank you to Barrett. This has been a great discussion, given us all a lot of food for thought, and I definitely want to see those slides as well. I'll distribute those to whoever else needs those. Everybody on the call and everybody